Hello and welcome to my video. I was asked by the children of Romilly Primary School what Barry was like during the Tudor period because they're learning about the Tudors currently in history lessons. So this video is the presentation that I made to them. Before we get cracking though, here's a couple little caveats. Caveat number one, this was recorded in a very echoey classroom. So many apologies for the sound quality. I have put subtitles together, and if you're watching on YouTube, then simply click on the CC button and then you'll get to see all those subtitles. Another little caveat, talking to the children about a local example of Tudor architecture. I spoke about Cadoxton Court. Now, I know how pedantic historians can be, so I just thought I'd throw this out here. I know perfectly well the whole building was not built in one go. I know it was built in stages. I know the dovecot dates back to the 14th century and is medieval. I know parts of the house are contemporary with that. And I know parts of the house were built after this period. However, talking to an audience of 10-year-old children and saying, if you want to see what a Tudor house looks like, just have a little peek at Cadoxton Court. I stand by that, and that is correct. So without any more apologies, I just hand you over to myself and the very curious and really enthusiastic children of Romilly Primary School.
About the Tudors, because you're learning about them, is that right? You're learning about them in history?
Yes.
Yeah? So I'm going to talk to you a bit. I'm not going to repeat things that you're already getting in your lessons. I'm going to talk about the Tudor period from a slightly different perspective, and hopefully it'll tie in with stuff you're learning at the moment. I can see I'm not going to have to tell you, we're going to bring it to Barry. So rather than look at what the Tudors who lived in Hampton Court did, and places that are far away, we're going to look at what Barry was like in the Tudor period. And we're also more specifically going to look at what it was like for children of your age back then. Because it was a very, very different world. There were lots of things that have changed since then. There's also quite a few things that are still the same. Then the thing we're going to finish up with is we're going to solve a mystery. And the mystery is this: how can an entire castle just vanish without a trace? What about Barry? What was going on at the end of this street? Well, we do have some information to help us work it out. And we're going to look at some things that were written down at this time by two different people. This first one is a man called John Speed. And throughout the 17th century, he compiled a series of maps of all the different places in Britain. And this one he published in 1610, which is after the Tudor period. The Tudor period ended in 1603. But he was compiling it during the Tudor period, so it is relevant to what we're looking at today. So, we're going to have a little look at what he saw when he came to Barry. That's what he saw. Now, don't know how familiar you are with how Barry looks now. So for comparison, this is a modern Google Maps image of Barry, and this is Speed's image of Barry. So you can see the differences. Now, besides obvious things like this is clearly digital and it's been typed, and it's colour, what differences do you spot straight away? Go on, what can you see?
Barry Island is the
Yeah, look at that. Here's Barry Island now. It's all joined together. You've got roads and houses and railway lines. Back then, it was a proper island. It had sea around it, yeah?
Barry isn't even spelled the same.
Very good. Not the first person to spot that. Yeah, let's go through them as we're getting into it. So obviously a lot of things hadn't been invented then, okay? There's no airports because we didn't have planes back in the Tudor period. Didn't have railway lines because we didn't have trains. Surprisingly, we didn't even have any roads around here. There was a road, the nearest one was in Wenford. So around here was all dirt tracks, yes?
Instead of using paths nowadays, they used to use horses.
Horses and donkeys. But then you had to have a fair amount of money to afford a horse or a donkey. But most people, it was just on foot. Here's a thing, look at Barry now. Look how big Barry is. Barry is the biggest town in Wales. It's a big, big old place, Barry. But back then, it was quite small. He's marked it up with just a couple of houses. This was a very, very small place. And also, places that are now part of Barry, like Cadoxton, Merthyr Dublin, they're now all in Barry. But back then, they were different places. They were separate, and they seem to be, quite spread out compared to how it is today. Also, we've already had this one. Barry Island was a proper island, but he didn't mark any buildings on here. So there are no houses on Barry. Barry Island's covered in houses now. Nothing on there back then. And there was a castle in Porthkerry. Hold that thought, because we're going to come back to that. But he marked a castle in Porthkerry. And this is the other point he made, is the spellings. Look, they've got Barry with an E on the end. Porthkerry instead of Porthkerry. Rouse instead of Roos. Funtagare and Funman, which is Welsh for having a laugh. So, there we thank you, one of the teachers. So yeah, lots and lots of things that were different back then to how they are now. So that gives us a little bit of information, not a lot, because it's just kind of like an aerial view of what the place looked like. But we can pad this information out because of a really famous man called John Leland. He's called the father of British history because he spent his life going around the country writing down everything he saw. And as much as that might have seemed dull at the time, now, when we look back, it shows us so much about what happened and what things were like. And he came to Barry. Yes. But yeah, he came to Barry in 1538, which is when Henry VIII was king. So he was here, right slap bang in the middle of the Tudor period. And that's what he wrote. So there we are. I'm not going to expect you to kind of, I have translated this, but this tells us something else that's changed a lot since Tudor times, is the language we speak. Because don't forget, we already had a law saying you were only allowed to speak English. So this is English. But if I read some of this to you, this won't sound like any English that you know. So, let's go. Where cometh the little rye of fresh water to the Severn is about a mile of headed from the rill, is scant a mile of ear northeast. In a playground on this beck stondeth Custer. That was the English people used to speak in Tudor times. It's completely changed. It's nothing like what we speak these days. If you spend a bit of time looking at it, you would probably be able to work it out. But it's a huge change from our English. So I've translated it for you, save you a bit of time. And this is effectively what Leland wrote about Barry when he visited. So let's break some of this down and look at what he's talking about. Now, the castle on your street, young man, Leland spoke about it. Barry Castle, he said, mostly in ruins. That was 400 years ago. It was ruined then. So that gives you an idea of how old that castle was, because it was past its usable life, even in Tudor times. What else did he look at? In the sea, beyond the river mouth, is Barry Island. It can be reached only at low tide. So when the tide goes out, it's the only time you can get to Barry Island. The rest of the time it is totally cut off. He said it's linked by a causeway in poor condition. A causeway, just so you know, is like a little road that's slightly raised above the seabed. So when the tide goes out, you can go across it. But that's all that was there. He also said, about Barry Island, there is a wood and crops growing on the island, and a farm which can be rented for £10 a year. There are no houses. Nothing like Barry Island now, is it? It doesn't sound like Barry Island. Also, something has changed a lot. Not only are there now houses on Barry Island and no fields, shows how much money has changed. For £10 a year in the Tudor period, and that at the time would have seemed like a lot of money. For £10 a year, you could rent the whole island. Right now, you will spend £1,000 a month for one house on Barry Island. So that is a huge change as time has progressed. But here's the thing that interests me, right? There's nothing very much going on in Barry, apart from this one thing, okay? So there are no houses on the island, but in the middle, there is a chapel dedicated to St. Barrack. A lot of people come to visit this chapel on pilgrimages. Now, do you know, when I say a chapel, do you know where it is? Have you seen it? Yeah? Some of you have? Let me help you out then. So, here's Jackson's Bay, Barry Island, so right over the far side from where we are now. Above Jackson's Bay, you've got this big green area called Nell's Point. And at the top end of that, by the road that leads down to all the new houses, you've got a little wooded area. And in that wooded area, you've got that wall. That's all that's left. That's all that's left of the chapel that John Leland's talking about. Now, he says that there's not much going on in Barry, but for some reason, Lots of people are coming to this chapel on a pilgrimage. Every year, everyone has to go on a pilgrimage. Let me pad this out a little bit. So, people back then, I've already mentioned this, much more religious than they are now. They used to go to church pretty much every day. Once a year, they went on a pilgrimage, and it was considered absolutely vital that they did. If you were rich, you might go to Jerusalem, to the Holy Land, or to Rome. But ordinary people, they would have to travel somewhere that didn't cost too much. So they'd come, a lot of them would come to places like Barry Island. Why did they do it? They believed it would bring them closer to God. They also believed that if they were ill or injured, that they would get cured by visiting a place of pilgrimage. And there used to be a well on the island, which has been closed over now, and people used to tell stories of being able to walk after not being able to walk all their lives, and being cured of diseases by drinking the water from the well. Yes?
Did that really work?
Probably not, but people used to believe it. People were much more open to these sort of ideas back then. But there's something else the pilgrimage gave us, okay? So today, when you go away for a week in the summer to a beach or something like that, what's that called? You're going on a
Vacation.
vacation, let's think of another word. A holiday, yeah? So a lot of people, since the sort of 1950s, have gone on a holiday to Barry Island. The word holiday comes from holy day, because people used to go on pilgrimages to places like Barry Island because it was so holy. So that's where the word holiday comes from. So the people have ironically been going on holidays in Barry Island since Tudor times, and older, to be honest. It's a lot older than that, but it was just still going on in Leland's day. So why? You've got a house here, I've noticed at school, called Barrack. Yeah? Does anyone actually know the story? Say that. Let me tell you, just to be on the safe side. So, this was way before the Tudor period was happened. We're going back best part of 1,000 years before, so a long time before. There was a monk called Barrack. And go on, I'll come to you in a second. And Barrack used to live on his own on Barry Island, because as we've just seen, there were no houses there. So it was a really lonely place to be. And the story goes that Barrack wanted a book. And this book was on a monastery over on one of the home islands, which is one of the islands you can see when you look out across the Bristol Channel. So he got into his boat, he rowed out to the island, he went to the monastery, he found the book he wanted and rowed back. But as he was rowing back to Barry Island, a huge storm built up, and it capsized his boat and he was drowned. And his body washed up onto the beach of Barry Island, where it was found and he was buried. Now, not long after that, some fishermen were out in their boats around Barry Island, and one of them caught a salmon, which is quite a big fish. And when they got the salmon on the boat, they cut it open, and inside, what do you think they found? The book. They found the book. And that was declared as a miracle, and because it was a miracle, the Pope declared that Barrack was a saint. And then that's when the story started about people who came to visit where he was buried, drink the water from the well that he used to drink when he lived on the island, and they were cured of diseases and they were made able to walk, and all these wonderful stories. But that happened possibly 7th century. So years and centuries later, people are still coming to Barry Island because they still believe this story, and they still want to taste the water in the well, and they still want to be cured. So it just goes to show, you know, where these things originate from and how long they carry on for. But it all came to an end, didn't it? We don't still go on pilgrimage to Barry Island. I showed you a picture of the chapel, and it's already in ruins. So something happened, and it was all down to this man. Henry VIII, he called a stop to all of this nonsense. He thought the pilgrimages were too Catholic, and he didn't like Catholicism, so he wanted to call a stop to that. He closed the chapel on Barry Island, and when they closed the chapel, no one was looking after it, which is why it's in ruins today. It just all fell apart. But that was the only thing that was going on in Barry back then, and that all got drawn to a halt because of a decision made by Henry VIII. So there we go. We know something about Barry now. We know, you know, why the Tudor period overall was important, but also what was different about Barry back then. We know about pilgrimages and what they were, and why people went on them, and we even know why they came to an end. But what was it like for people like you back then here? What was it like being a kid in Barry? So, I put two pictures up there for a very clear reason, okay? Your life could not have been more different if you were rich or if you were poor. There was a massive difference back then, even much, much more than there is now. So, if you were a rich kid in Barry, then this is what your life looked like. Okay, so boys, you would be educated by monks, not teachers. Girls were not educated. The only subjects you were taught were Latin, Greek and RE, that's it, there was no other subjects. Your dads might teach you archery and how to hunt. Girls, you would just be taught social skills. So that's things like how to eat properly with a knife and fork, and not to eat with your mouth full, and not to talk unless you're spoken to, and rubbish like that. It was not a good time to be a girl. 12 years old was old enough to get married. So you guys are 9 and 10 now? Yeah? So 2 years from now, you'd be thinking about getting married. It was weird. It was a weird world back then. However, to make this real, the reality was there were no rich people in Barry at all, not a single one. The people who owned Barry lived in places like Penmark Castle, Fondmont Castle. They didn't live here. So there were no actual rich people. So this is the category that we're more concerned with, okay? This is what was here. Now, the life of a poor person in Tudor Barry was harsh. First statistic up there, 14% of children born in Tudor times died before their first birthday. Most babies did not, an awful lot of babies did not even make it to childhood. There were no schools. You can look at that as a good or a bad thing, it's up to you. But there was Sunday school. You did have to learn about religion, but that was it. Children as young as 8 had to work. So, I know. So, sort of work you would be doing, we just learned that the Barry Island was a farm, so you'd helped out on the farm, you'd be feeding the chickens and cleaning out the horses, that sort of stuff. There was also an opportunity for children to go to sea. There was a lot of, you had merchant ships in the area. Aberthaw was the nearest port, but you might have gone to sea to be like an errand boy or errand girl for a ship's captain. There was also a lot of piracy. There were a lot of pirates in this area. The Bristol Channel was rife with it. It got worse a bit later on in history, but in the Tudor period there's plenty of it going on. So you might possibly have got a job on a pirate ship. Could be exciting. If you were lucky that your father was a craftsman, so a thatcher or a mason or a boat builder, and he taught you those skills, then you were luckiest person in Barry, because those skills meant you could always get paid. You'd always make a big money. You'd never get rich, but you'd never starve either. So that was very, very, a small group of people got to get the best out of that. So where do they live? Well, if you had a bit of money, you might live in a house like this. This one's in Fountain Major. It's not very far. But the person who built that falls into the category of the sort of person I said about the beginning, about benefiting from banks and being able to borrow money. He was a merchant, which was a name for a business person back then. He was a merchant, he built that, and he lived there. Poorer people, like most Barry residents, would have lived in a house like that. That one's in Merthyr Mawr. Most of the houses in Barry from this period have gone, yes?
Do you still live in those houses now?
Yeah, this one is still, well, they're both still occupied. This one is a B&B as well as a house, and somebody rents that one, yes?
Yes, that's near where I live, the second one in Merthyr Mawr, and my friend actually lives in one of those houses in cottages.
There we go, they're very sought after now. It's not
Yes.
poor people who live there
Yes.
anymore.
I
There we go. There is a Tudor house in Barry. Cadoxton Court. So, you know where the YMCA and the police station is in Barry? Yeah, and you go down that hill. If you look up to the right-hand side, there's like a cliff, and on the top of the cliff, you'll see this, and that's a dovecot, and behind the dovecot is a building there or thereabouts, but Tudor style. Yeah, so that's the only building here now that was there then and built. Well, I tell you what, you'd have been quite strapped for things that you like. So rich people got to eat quite a varied diet: venison, deer, birds like pigeon. I mean, going back to this picture here, that's what this building's for. They kept pigeons in there so they could eat them. Swan, goose, fish. Beef or lamb was available, but only on special occasions. Vegetables from the garden. Somebody mentioned sugar earlier, but things like potatoes, sugar and salt, really expensive. Potatoes had only just been discovered right at the very end of the Tudor period. So no chips, because without potatoes you can't have chips. If you were poor, it was basically bread, vegetables from the garden, berries and mushrooms that you found, or fish that you caught. That was it. Fish, very dependent on fish, because obviously it's free, you just catch it and eat it. So, yeah, most of the things, most of your favourite fun. Well, look how short those lists are. There wasn't a lot to do for fun. If you were a girl, embroidery. So that's basically just sewing little patterns. Nice. If you were a boy, fishing, obviously, but then that was mainly to stay alive. Archery was a big deal. Football had just begun as a thing. Any football mad people in this group? Okay. So, how would you feel if you're only allowed to play football once a year? That's for a football mad person, that's going to be hard, isn't it? Well, mind you, having said that, Christmas did used to last a lot longer back then. So Christmas began on Christmas Eve, 24th December. It ended on a day called Candlemas. That was yesterday, 2nd of February. So Christmas lasted from the 24th of December to the 2nd of February. So Christmas, to be fair, was a lot longer. But that was the only time of year you were allowed to play football. Go on.
Did you get presents from Father Christmas back then?
No, Father Christmas came later. Father Christmas got invented, well, okay, it's another story. I could go on all day about that one. We'll come back to that one another time. But yeah, it was later on we had Father Christmas. People probably got gifts though, but it was mainly about eating and drinking and singing and that sort of thing. Yeah, so, a bit more about football then. The reason why, I've started saying this, the reason why you were not allowed to play football other than at Christmas time is because Henry VIII was obsessed with a war with France. So any time you had that was not spent working, you had to spend practicing your archery. So archery was the be-all and end-all, and that's why things like football had been banned except during Christmas. But football was a mental game back then. It was really mad. It was a brand new invention, so not everywhere, it wasn't played everywhere, it was just played in places who kind of got on board with the trend early. He didn't have 11 players on each side, entire villages used to play against each other, and he didn't have like a field where if you went outside the line you had to throw it in. The game just kept going and going and going. So you could go anywhere. Fighting was allowed. People died playing football in these days. It was so dangerous. And in Wales, we were particularly mad about this new sport, and boys and girls played, but there are stories about women hiding the ball under their skirts and walking off, and everyone going, where's the ball gone? And then scoring a goal. We had our own way of playing the game back then. But yeah, football was not a lot like the game that we recognise today, but that was the early beginnings of it. So there we go. So I've covered a lot. We're now to the detective bit.
Here is the mystery we need to solve. How can an entire castle just vanish without trace? Normally, if a building gets knocked down or demolished, there's always some indication that it had been there, a ditch or some earthworks or a pile of rubble at the very least. But in the case of Porthkerry Castle, there is nothing, no sign at all that ever it stood there. Now, we've got some conflicting evidence here. First of all, it did appear on, as we looked at earlier, so that's the proof that we have that it did at some point exist. However, I need to point out that John Leland observed that just to the west of Barry is the Cwm Kiddy, which of course is the stream that runs through Porthkerry, and he went on to say there are no notable buildings in the area. So either John Leland didn't notice the castle and Speed has got it right, or John Leland got it right and John Speed made a mistake. So there's some conflict about whether there was a castle there at all. But let's assume that there was, because the explanation as to what happened to it is quite entertaining. So for those of you who aren't particularly familiar with what we've got here is an aerial shot, courtesy of Google Maps, of what Porthkerry Park looks like. So the park itself is slap bang in the middle of the picture, as is labelled. Then running across the top portion, you've got the viaduct where the railway line is carried. Then down here at the bottom is the sea. And over here to the left, just amongst these trees here, that's where the castle should, in theory, be. But it isn't there. So if it's not there, what happened to it? Well, What might have happened to it is a tremendous force of nature known as a tsunami. If you're not familiar with what a tsunami is, basically if you get a volcanic eruption or an earthquake out at sea, it forces all the regular sized waves together until they form one absolutely massive tidal wave, similar to the sort of thing that you're looking at on this video right now. And when that happens, that is called a tsunami. And tsunamis have got the most incredible destructive force. They can travel many, many miles inland, and they can pretty much smash anything that is in their way. So for example, here we're looking at vans and minibuses and large vehicles being washed away like leaves on a drain. Absolutely quite spectacular. And it just gives you an idea of the sheer force that a tsunami carries. Well, why am I mentioning this? I'm mentioning this because we have on record that a tsunami affected us right here in Barry. One swept right the way up the Bristol Channel, either in 1606 or 1607. We have got records of it happening in both years. Generally speaking, people favour 1607, but I thought I'd be controversial. The engraving that you can see on the left-hand side of this picture, that gives you a really good idea of the destruction that the tsunami left in its wake. People having to sit on the roof of their houses for shelter while animals and people and babies are being washed away. The areas worst hit were the areas further up the estuary, so the sort of floodplains around North Somerset and in Monmouthshire. But it did also have effects further down. We know that St Mary's Church in Cardiff was lost to the tsunami, and there is every possibility that so too was our castle. And we have a little bit of local naming to bring that into is where the castle would have stood. It's the picture on the right hand side, which shows the headland of Porthkerry, and our castle should in theory be on the end of that. However, it isn't. But what we do have on the left hand side is this rock, and that rock has always been known locally as Castle Rock. So the theory is that when the tsunami came through in 1607, it ripped the whole side of the cliff with the castle on top of it as well and just dumped it unceremoniously into the sea, and all that's left of it now is Castle Rock. So there we are. We've had our romp through Tudor Barry. We've solved a mystery about a disappearing castle, and I really hope you've enjoyed this video. The latter part of it may seem a bit tame. That's because playtime happened, and the noise of the children outside drowned out me trying to tell you about Tudor Barry. If you've enjoyed this video, then please feel free to area. This channel on YouTube you can subscribe to, so you get told every time a new video gets uploaded, and all my videos are about Welsh history, mainly in the Vale of Glamorgan or pubs further afield. If you want to look deep, these are the lists of sources where it all came from. I'd like to thank you all very much for joining me, and I hope to see you all again soon. Take care.